Hello, my name is Morgan, and I'm 30 years old. If you met me in uniform, you'd probably assume I've lived a life full of respect, certainty, and purpose. You might even imagine a childhood where discipline and honor were taught around the dinner table, where my parents proudly framed my achievements on the living room wall, and where every success I earned was celebrated the way victories are meant to be celebrated. But the truth is, my life has never looked like that. The world sees me as Commander Morgan, U.S. Navy officer, mission leader, the woman who has spent the last decade proving her worth across oceans and bases most civilians will never know exist. Yet the people who raised me, the people whose approval I once begged for more than medals, still see me as nothing more than their daughter who works as a nurse in the Navy. I remember the first time someone saluted me. I was 22, standing on the deck of a destroyer cutting through the Atlantic. The wind whipped against my face, the sky stretched open like an endless challenge, and one of the younger sailors walked by and snapped a crisp salute. It was a small moment, the kind that happens thousands of times across the Navy, but to me it felt like the universe finally whispering, "You've earned this." From that day on, I wore my uniform like a second skin. Every ribbon, every pin, every hard-earned stripe on my shoulder carried a story, a night in rough waters, a decision made in seconds, a life saved, a team guided home. But none of those stories ever made it past the front door of my childhood home. At home, I'm never Commander Morgan. I'm never the woman who ran emergency operations during a cyclone evacuation. I'm never the officer who once stood between chaos and her team and found a way to bring everyone back alive.
No.
At home, I'm simply the daughter my parents introduced with a shrug, as if my entire career could fit into a small, unimportant label. She's just a nurse in the Navy, they say. Nothing big, nothing special. They say it casually, as if they genuinely believe it. As if the years of service, the discipline, the sacrifices, all of it holds no more value than a part-time summer job. Growing up, I always thought things would change. I believed that one day my parents, Thomas and Helen, would finally look at me and see someone worth being proud of. But the truth settled slowly, painfully. They never would. Not because I hadn't achieved enough, but because their hearts were already filled to the edges with someone else. My younger brother, Jake. Jake, the golden child. Jake, the boy who never finished anything he started. Jake, who floated from job to job, hobby to hobby, responsibility to responsibility. Yet somehow, in my parents' eyes, he was the brightest star in the universe. They celebrated his smallest actions as if he'd climbed mountains. If Jake washed the car, Dad would say, "That boy is responsible." If he woke up before noon on a weekend, Mom would beam, "He's so dedicated." And me? I could come home with a commendation letter from a rear admiral and hear nothing more than, "Oh, that's nice, honey. Did you bring Jake something?" So, I learned to keep my victories to myself. I learned to applaud my own progress. I learned that sometimes the world outside your home sees your worth more clearly than the people who raised you. Most days, it didn't bother me, not in a way that stopped me from doing my job. I buried the hurt under focus, under missions, under responsibility. But there were quiet moments, late nights in cramped bunks, sunsets on steel decks, early mornings before briefing, when the ache of being unseen found its way back. And still, I kept serving. I kept leading. I kept proving myself to the only place that ever truly recognized my worth, the Navy. I didn't know then that everything I'd buried would come crashing to the surface soon, sooner than I ever expected. And the event that finally forced my family to see me was something I never saw coming. When I look back on my childhood, I realize the signs were always there, quiet, ordinary moments that should have told me exactly how the story of my family was going to unfold. But children don't see favoritism the way adults do. They don't recognize the difference between love and comparison. They simply learn to adjust themselves around the things that hurt. My entire life has been one long adjustment. My parents, Thomas and Helen, weren't cruel. They weren't neglectful. They provided food, shelter, school, clothes, the basics that make a home look normal from the outside. But love was unevenly poured. If Jake needed 1 ounce of attention, he received a bucket. If I needed a bucket, I received drops. Their favoritism toward my brother wasn't loud or dramatic. It was subtle, the kind that hides behind smiles and excuses. It took me years to see it clearly. Jake was the kind of kid who quit everything he started. Soccer, baseball, art class, community college. He walked away from all of it. Yet every time he quit, my parents found a way to spin it into something admirable. He's still exploring his path, Dad would say. He's figuring out his strengths, Mom would add. Meanwhile, I was the child who followed every rule, aced every class, and worked harder than anyone around me. But accomplishment only seemed to raise the bar for what counted as enough. I still remember the day I received my acceptance letter to the Naval Academy. It was the day I thought, foolishly, that everything would change. I walked into the kitchen holding the envelope with trembling hands, my heart pounding in excitement. Jake was sprawled on the couch, half asleep, scrolling his phone. Mom, Dad. I got in, I said, waiting for some kind of reaction. Something big. Something meaningful. Mom looked up from rinsing dishes and said, "Oh, that's nice, honey. Jake, did you eat? You should really eat something healthy today." Dad nodded distractedly and replied, "Good job," without looking up from his newspaper. I stood there for a full minute waiting for something more. But that was it. Later that night, Jake announced he wanted to try guitar lessons. My parents nearly threw a celebration. Dad rushed to buy him an expensive instrument. Mom posted it on Facebook, calling Jake a talented artist discovering his passion. They invited relatives over for dinner. They made a cake for Jake's guitar lessons, not for my acceptance into the Naval Academy. Moments like these shape me more than any training or mission ever could. They taught me that love in my house wasn't based on effort or achievement. It was based on bias. A bias so deep my parents didn't even recognize it anymore. Jake wasn't just their son. He was their pride, their hope, their favorite. And me? I was the responsible child, the helpful one, the she'll be fine daughter, the placeholder, the background character in my own home. I tried to ignore it. I tried to rise above it. But favoritism is a quiet kind of wound. It doesn't bleed. It doesn't scream, but it never fully heals. It sits there, beneath the surface, waiting for the moment life presses down just hard enough to make it hurt again. I didn't know that moment was coming soon. And when it arrived, it changed everything. I had just returned from a 72-hour operational readiness drill when the wedding invitation arrived. My entire body ached with the familiar stiffness that comes after long stretches of focus, tension, and barely any sleep. I dropped my duffel bag by the door of my apartment, kicked off my boots, and walked toward the small pile of mail on the kitchen counter. Most of it was predictable: bills, ads, base notices. But then I saw a cream-colored envelope with gold accents, thick cardstock, decorative edges, the kind of thing people order only for weddings or graduations. And there it was, my brother Jake's wedding invitation. I froze for a moment, staring at it like it was some sort of mistake. I checked the postmark. It had been mailed just 3 days ago. The wedding date printed on the front, Saturday, was only 2 days away. 2 days. My own brother. A major life event. And I was the last person to know. I slid my thumb beneath the flap and opened the envelope. Inside was a beautifully designed invitation with Jake and his fiancée's names printed in elegant script. The venue was a stylish country club just outside the city. The time was 4 p.m. The dress code was formal. There was no handwritten note. No personal message. Nothing that said, "Wish you could be there" or "Hope you can make it." Just the cold, impersonal formality of an invitation sent out of obligation. I felt a familiar heaviness settle in my chest. Another reminder, one I never asked for, of exactly where I stood in my family. Not a priority. Not someone they were eager to celebrate with. Just someone they remembered to notify at the last second, so they wouldn't look bad in front of extended family. I leaned against the counter and let out a slow breath. I shouldn't have been surprised. My parents always kept me at the edges of their world. But something about this moment stung more than usual. Maybe because it was Jake's wedding. Maybe because I had spent years imagining that, despite everything, Jake at least still cared enough to keep me included. But 2 days? 2 days was not inclusion. It was a message, loud and clear. Even so, a part of me, the part that still believed in family despite every disappointment, wanted to attend. Not for my parents. Not to prove anything. But because Jake was still my brother, even if he'd long stopped treating me like his sister. I set the invitation down carefully on the table, smoothing the corners. I didn't know what the wedding day would bring. I didn't know whose version of me the guests would hear about. And I certainly didn't know how drastically my presence would shift the entire room once I walked in. All I knew was this. I was going. No matter how late the invitation had been sent. It was later that same evening, long after I'd showered and changed into something comfortable, that I finally sat down with a cup of coffee and opened my laptop. I wanted to know more about the woman Jake was marrying. Not out of curiosity alone, but because something inside me whispered that this wedding held more layers than my parents would ever bother explaining. So, I typed her name, Jessica Palmer, into the search bar. The first thing that appeared on the screen stopped me mid-sip. A Navy profile. An official one. Jessica Palmer. Lieutenant, United States Navy. Operations Division. I blinked twice, just to make sure fatigue hadn't scrambled my vision. But the words remained the same. Jake's fiancée wasn't just in the Navy. She was an officer. A commissioned officer. And not just that. I recognized her. Because I had served with her. Suddenly, memories surfaced. Pacific exercises, strategy meetings, a high-pressure search and rescue operation where I'd been mission lead and she'd been part of the communications unit. Jessica had been sharp, observant, and respectful. She followed chain of command with precision and always addressed me with an unwavering, "Yes, ma'am." I'd supervised her team on 2 separate deployments. She wasn't just a colleague, she was one of my juniors. And she had absolutely no idea that Jake, the man she was about to marry, was my brother. I sat back in my chair, stunned. If Jessica didn't know, then her parents didn't know. If her parents didn't know, then the Navy officers attending the wedding didn't know. And if none of them knew, then they definitely had no clue who I really was. That meant only one thing. My parents had already introduced me to them in their usual way, likely downplaying my rank and identity, shaping a version of me that fit their small, comfortable narrative. I could practically hear my mother's voice in my head. "Oh, our daughter? She's just a nurse in the Navy. Nothing special." The thought made my jaw tighten. Jessica marrying Jake. Jessica thinking she was entering a respectful, honest family. Jessica unaware that her future in-laws were the same people who had spent years belittling the woman who once led her in uniform. And the irony? They were about to be surrounded by Navy officers, her colleagues, her mentors, her chain of command, people who would immediately recognize my rank the moment I walked in wearing my uniform. I imagined the scene. Their confusion. Their shock. Their whispers. Their questions. Why did her own family lie about her? Why would anyone hide a commander's identity? A strange mix of anticipation and dread rippled through me. I knew one thing for certain. This wedding was not going to be the quiet, simple event my parents expected. Not with Jessica there. Not with all those Navy officers in the room. Not with the truth hanging in the air like an unpulled trigger. And definitely not when I walked through those doors. The day of the wedding arrived faster than I expected. I spent the morning in quiet preparation, laying out my dress uniform with the same precision I used before inspections or briefings. Every ribbon was polished, every pin aligned, every crease sharp. I wasn't wearing the uniform to flaunt anything, I was wearing it because it was who I was. And because for once, I wasn't going to shrink myself to fit the small space my parents kept trying to shove me into. By the time I reached the venue, a beautifully decorated country club with white pillars, polished floors, and a backdrop of manicured gardens, the ceremony hadn't started yet. But I could hear the soft hum of voices drifting from inside. I paused at the entrance, taking a breath, steadying myself before walking in. Old habits. The kind that came from years of stepping into rooms where I had to lead, command, or protect. I wasn't inside yet, but I could hear my parents before I even opened the doors. Their voices were unmistakable. Oh, our daughter, my mother, Helen, said with that familiar dismissive tone she used whenever the topic was me. She's just a nurse in the Navy. Nothing special. You know how it is, she travels, she works long hours, very basic things. My jaw tightened immediately. Just a nurse. Nothing special. I remained still, half hidden behind the door, listening, because sometimes the truth is easier to hear from behind a wall. One of the guests, a man with a deep, curious voice, likely one of the Navy officers, asked politely, "What command does she work under? Which unit?" My father, Thomas, answered with a vague laugh. "Oh no, she's not involved in anything major. She's not one of the important ones. She just assists medical staff, that's all. Don't expect too much." There it was again. The smallness. The casual belittling. The way they clipped my wings in front of strangers because they couldn't handle the truth of who I had become. Then I heard another voice. A woman this time. Soft, respectful, but surprised. I heard she serves overseas. That doesn't sound small at all. My mother quickly replied, "Oh, they exaggerate those things. She's nothing like Jessica. Jessica is a real officer. She does actual Navy work." My breath caught. Jessica, my junior, was being praised by my own parents while I, a commander, was being minimized to something barely worth mentioning. The irony burned beneath my ribs. And then the question that sealed everything. "So," someone asked, "is she coming today?" My mother's answer was sharp. "If she shows up. She's always busy with her little duties. And honestly, with her attitude, I wouldn't be surprised if she didn't." A few people chuckled politely. That was enough. I pushed open the door a little, just enough to see inside. The hall was filled with guests, faces full of expectation, conversation, and polite smiles. Jessica's parents stood elegantly near the front. Navy officers in formal dress whites were scattered across the room, their posture rigid and respectful. The decor was stunning, golden lights reflecting off glass and silver. Everything screamed luxury. Everything except the words coming out of my parents' mouths. For a moment, I simply stood there, letting the sting wash over me and fade. I'd been here before, this place where my achievements were invisible. But something was different today. Something inside me had shifted. Maybe it was the uniform. Maybe it was Jessica. Maybe it was simply time. I straightened my shoulders. Because the moment I stepped inside, everything they had just said was going to fall apart in front of everyone. I stood just outside the double doors of the wedding hall, the polished wood cold beneath my fingertips. For a moment, I let myself breathe, slowly, deeply. The way I had been trained to before stepping into briefings where every word mattered, or operations where every second could change someone's life. This time, the stakes were different. No lives were on the line. No mission codes. No tactical decisions. But somehow, this felt heavier. I adjusted the edge of my dress uniform jacket one last time. The deep navy blue fabric hugged my shoulders perfectly, the silver buttons gleaming under the soft hallway lights. My ribbon sat neatly over my heart, proof of years no one at this wedding had ever bothered to ask me about. My commander rank insignia rested on my shoulder boards, polished until they reflected like mirrors. I wasn't here to prove anything. I was here as myself. My true self. The self my parents had never allowed the world to see. Inside, I heard a burst of polite laughter. My mother's laugh. High, airy, and dripping with the same sugary falseness she used whenever she was pretending her world was perfectly organized. I could almost picture the way she'd be smiling, chin high, hands clasped, talking about Jake as if he were a decorated officer instead of a man who barely held a job for more than 3 months at a time. My father's voice followed. Lower. Confident. The kind of voice that loved the sound of its own authority even when it was rooted in nothing. I tightened my jaw again. Not in anger, in preparation. Then I reached forward and pushed the door. It didn't slam. It didn't creak. It simply opened, quietly, smoothly, letting a wave of warm golden light spill into the hallway. The music softened. Conversation slowed. A few heads turned lazily, until they saw me. It was subtle at first, a shift in posture, a pause mid-sentence. Then, like a ripple through still water, the reaction spread. The first to stand were the Navy officers. Daniel noticed me instantly. His eyes widened before he straightened his back with trained reflex and snapped to attention. "Commander Morgan, ma'am." Hannah, who had been holding a glass of sparkling cider, nearly dropped it as she placed it quickly on the nearest table and followed suit. "Ma'am." Every Navy officer in the hall rose to their feet in a synchronized wave of formality and respect. Their voices echoed, strong and clear. "Ma'am." The room fell silent. Every conversation died mid-breath. Every guest turned. Heads slowly swiveled toward the entrance where I stood, still, composed, letting the uniform speak for me. My father's jaw dropped first. My mother blinked so many times I wondered if her eyes were malfunctioning. Jake stared like he'd seen something rise from the ocean. But the most striking reaction came from Jessica. She gasped so loudly people around her turned. She stood up so quickly her chair scraped sharply against the floor. Then, with disbelief melting into awe, she hurried toward me. "Ma'am," she breathed out, a hand pressed to her chest. You're Jake's sister? Commander Morgan here?" The wedding hall, decorated with ivory flowers and gold-lined tablecloths, suddenly felt like the deck of a ship. Quiet, tense, reverent. I stepped forward, heels clicking lightly against the marble floor, every movement steady and controlled. The officers maintained their salute until I nodded permission. "At ease," I said softly. They relaxed instantly, but their eyes remained locked on me with respect. I glanced at Jessica. "It's good to see you, Lieutenant." She swallowed hard, her face flushed with emotion. "I had no idea. Your parents, they—" She stopped herself, but I knew exactly what she wanted to say. "They lied. They diminished you." My mother's voice cracked first. "And Morgan, why are they calling you that?" I met her eyes. Calm. Unshaken. "Because that's who I am." Jessica stepped closer, now addressing the entire room. Her voice rang out with firm clarity, her officer tone, the one I remembered training her to use. "This woman is not a nurse. She is Commander Morgan, one of the most respected officers I've ever served under. She has led critical missions, saved countless lives, and has more honor and experience than most people could dream of." Gasps filled the hall. Someone whispered, "A commander? Her? The daughter they said was nothing?" Jessica looked directly at my parents. "You told everyone she was just a nurse. You hid her identity. You belittled someone your own Navy respects more than anyone in this room." My mother's face turned pale. My father looked like his breathing had stopped entirely. I simply stood there, quiet, steady, letting their lies fall apart on their own. And as I scanned the room, seeing the shock, the respect, the shifting perception, one truth became clear. The moment I walked through those doors, the version of me my parents had spent years crafting died instantly. Jessica stood beside me, her breath still unsteady, her eyes darting between my uniform, the stunned guests, and my parents, who now looked like the ground beneath them was cracking open. For a moment, she didn't speak. She simply took me in, as if piecing together every memory she had of working under my command. And then she straightened her shoulders the way I'd seen her do countless times during high-pressure operations. She stepped forward, placing herself between me and the room, not to shield me, but to face the people who had just finished minimizing my existence. "Everyone," she said, her voice sharp but controlled. "I think there's something you all deserve to know." People who had been whispering fell silent. Chairs creaked softly as guests leaned forward. Even the string quartet in the corner stopped mid-note as one of the violinists lowered her bow. Jessica looked directly at my parents first. "Mr. and Mrs. Matthews," she said, her tone respectful but edged with disbelief. "You introduced your daughter as a nurse." Not once, but repeatedly. My mother blinked, her face draining of color. Well, she is." "No," Jessica said firmly. "She isn't." Then she turned to the room, her voice growing stronger. "This woman, this incredible woman, is Commander Morgan, one of the most exceptional officers I have ever had the privilege of serving under. She is the reason half of my division made it home from a rescue mission 3 years ago. She is the reason I am the officer I am today. A wave of shocked murmurs spread across the room. Navy officers who already knew my rank lifted their chins with subtle pride, as if Jessica's words justified the respect they'd shown moments earlier. Jessica continued, stepping closer to me while addressing the crowd. Commander Morgan has led operations that demanded courage most people will never understand. She has stood on the front lines of storms, crises, and missions that would break even the strongest of us. She didn't earn her title by luck. She earned it by sacrifice. My father opened his mouth, but Jessica didn't let him interrupt. You told everyone she handles basic tasks, she said, eyes locked on my parents. You told us she was nothing special, just someone doing small work. But this woman holds a rank that requires years of excellence, discipline, and service. She is respected across bases and fleets. Officers rise when she enters a room because she has earned that respect. The words echoed in the hall like a verdict. I felt every pair of eyes on me, not with pity, not with curiosity, but with a dawning realization. People exchanged glances. A few stood up out of respect. A couple of Navy officers nodded subtly, as if appreciating Jessica's devotion to the truth. Jessica inhaled deeply and turned fully toward my parents. You lied, she said plainly. You didn't just downplay her role. You erased her identity. You robbed your own daughter of the pride she deserved. You disrespected her in front of people who would have been honored to know her. My mother covered her mouth with trembling fingers. My father looked away, his shoulders sinking. Jessica's voice softened, but the honesty in it was unwavering. If I had known that the commander who guided me, trained me, and protected me was part of this family, I would have expected pride. Not shame. Not excuses. Not lies. She looked at Jake then, her fiancé. And I would have expected you, she said quietly, to cherish a sister like her. Not ignore her. Not allow your parents to hide her. Not treat her as an afterthought. Jake's face went red with humiliation. Jessica turned back to the crowd, her final statement sharp and unforgettable. This woman deserves honor. She deserves respect. She deserved a family who spoke her truth, not one that silenced it. The room didn't clap. It didn't need to. The silence itself was the loudest applause I had ever heard. For a long moment after Jessica's words, the hall remained frozen, caught somewhere between disbelief and truth. The music had stopped, conversations had died, and even the air felt still. No one seemed to know what to say next. Every pair of eyes flicked between me, Jessica, and my parents, as if waiting for someone to break the tension. But the next voice that rose wasn't mine. It was Jessica's. She turned slowly toward Jake, her expression no longer filled with awe or shock. It was something sharper, something steadier, a kind of hurt wrapped inside clarity. Jake took a small step toward her, panic flickering in his eyes, but Jessica lifted a hand to stop him. Jake, she said quietly, I need to ask you something. And I want honesty, real honesty. He swallowed hard. Okay. Did you know? Her voice trembled just slightly, anger fighting with disappointment. Did you know your sister was a commander? Did you know who she really was? Jake hesitated. Just a second. But it was enough. Jessica's lips parted in disbelief. You did, she whispered. You knew, and you let your parents lie about her? You let them minimize her? You let them erase her in front of my family, in front of my colleagues? Jake tried to reach for her hand. Jessica, it wasn't like that. It was exactly like that, she said, stepping back. You allowed it. You stood by and watched your own sister be disrespected. If you can do that to her, what would you do to me? His mouth opened, closed, then opened again. No words coming. Jessica turned to her parents next. They looked devastated, sensing what was coming. She gave them a gentle, heartbreaking smile, the kind someone gives right before they walk away from a dream they once believed in. Mom, Dad, I can't marry into a family like this, she said softly, but her voice carried through the hall like a command. I refuse to tie my life to people who have no respect for someone who has earned the honor of an entire military branch. My mother gasped. My father whispered something incoherent. Jake's face crumpled. Jessica shook her head, tears burning in her eyes. I deserve honesty. I deserve integrity. And your sister, Commander Morgan, deserves far more than what she received here today. She looked at me then, really looked at me, with a mixture of respect, pain, and apology. I'm sorry, ma'am, she whispered. You deserved better from all of us. And with that, she stepped away from Jake, away from the altar, away from the future she had planned. Her parents followed her as she walked toward the exit, her posture firm, her decision final. The whispers erupted behind her, but she never turned back. Jake's wedding didn't just end. It shattered. For several seconds after Jessica walked out, no one moved. The room felt suspended, like a glass ornament hanging by a thread, trembling, waiting to fall. I remained standing where I was, centered in a space that finally, painfully, belonged to the truth. The guests murmured, shifting uncomfortably. The Navy officers watched silently, their expressions unreadable but respectful. And then, I heard footsteps.
Jake.
He approached me slowly, his face flushed with shame, his shoulders hunched as though each breath carried the weight of what had just unfolded. When he stopped in front of me, he couldn't even meet my eyes. Morgan, he whispered. I'm so sorry. His voice cracked, and for the first time in years, he looked like the little brother who used to follow me around the yard with scraped knees and wild ideas. But that boy had disappeared long ago, buried under our parents' constant praise and the comfort of knowing he never had to try for anything. And now all that entitlement had collapsed at his feet. I should have defended you, he said, voice trembling. I should have told Jessica who you really were. I should have stopped Mom and Dad. I didn't want to start a fight. I looked at him calmly. Sometimes doing what's right is a fight, Jake. He winced, and tears gathered in his eyes. Before he could respond, I saw my parents approaching behind him. Helen's hands were shaking. Thomas looked like someone had taken every ounce of confidence from him and ground it into dust. Their faces, usually proud, composed, and unyielding, were pale, frightened, and finally aware. Sweetheart, my mother began, but her voice wavered. Morgan, we never meant for things to get this far. We didn't think. You didn't think. I finished for her, my voice steady, not cruel. Not about me. Not about how your words affected me. Not about the truth. My father swallowed hard. We're sorry, he said, his tone quieter than I had ever heard. We didn't realize, we never imagined you were. A commander? I asked, raising a brow. Because you never asked. You never cared to know. He dropped his gaze. The silence between us stretched, heavy with years of hurt that had never been acknowledged. My mother stepped closer, tears streaming down her cheeks. Please forgive us, she whispered. We were wrong. For the first time in my life, they weren't defending themselves. They weren't explaining things away. They stood there, stripped of their excuses, needing something from me. But I had learned long ago that forgiveness isn't a bandage you place on a wound that never healed. I took a deep breath and spoke clearly, so every word reached the places inside me that had stayed quiet for far too long. I served my country with everything I had. I earned my rank. I earned my respect. But I never earned yours, and that's something I can't fix for you. That's something you have to fix for yourselves. My mother sobbed. Jake looked shattered. My father's shoulders sagged. I'm not angry, I continued softly. But I'm done shrinking myself to fit into the space you created for me. Today showed me exactly where I stand in this family. And I think it's time I stand somewhere else. I stepped back, letting the meaning settle in their hearts like cold water. Jake reached out. Morgan, please don't go. I shook my head gently. I've spent my whole life staying. Now it's time to leave. And with that, I turned away from them, calm, steady, finally free. When I stepped outside the wedding hall, the cool evening air wrapped around me like a quiet truth I had spent my whole life searching for. The sky above was turning a deep shade of indigo, the kind of color that always reminded me of the open ocean at night. Vast, steady, honest. I walked across the stone pathway slowly, each step lighter than the last, as if the weight I had carried for 30 years had finally begun to slip away. For the first time ever, I wasn't walking away in defeat. I was walking away in dignity. I reached the edge of the parking lot and paused, looking back at the glowing windows of the hall. Inside that building, years of silence, minimization, and erasure had finally cracked open. And even though the aftermath was heartbreaking, Jake's broken engagement, my parents' humiliation, the messy truth laid bare, it was also the first time my family had been forced to see me clearly. Commander Morgan, a woman they couldn't shrink anymore. I took a long breath and let it out slowly, feeling the tension dissolve from my shoulders. A strange calm settled in my chest, soft, steady, unfamiliar. I wasn't angry, not anymore. Anger had been replaced by something stronger, clarity. I unlocked my car and placed my cover gently on the passenger seat. Sitting behind the wheel, I let myself reflect on everything that had led to this moment. The missions, the long nights at sea, the sacrifices, the fractures inside my home, and finally, the truth that had erupted in front of a room full of strangers. Painful as it was, it had given me something I never had before, the courage to choose myself. As I started the engine, I whispered a quiet promise, not to them, but to myself. A promise that my worth would no longer be something I allowed others to define. A promise that I would live my life the way I served my country, with honor, with purpose, and without apology. The road ahead stretched out beneath the soft glow of streetlights, open and waiting. And as I drove forward, leaving the past behind, one truth settled deep inside me, clear, sharp, and unshakable. Sometimes the greatest freedom isn't earned on the battlefield. It's earned the moment you walk away from those who never saw your worth. Thank you for listening to today's story. If you enjoyed it and would like to hear more powerful stories like this, make sure to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for new stories every day. Your support helps these stories reach more people, and I truly appreciate it. See you in the next story.